I know not many people are going to agree with it, but quite frankly, I feel that Citlali has more of an Archon style kit than Mavuika does. Yes, of course she's not an Archon, right? But neither is Farina by the lore of the game, right? But her kit design is definitely Archon-like. But overall, I'm just going to explore around with some things that I like about Citlali's kit in order to explain that, for me, at least, she is more of an Archon character, right? She doesn't have to be to you, but she does more of what I would expect an Archon kit to do, where she enables me to have fun with new teams in new ways in the game. Like, yes, we could do things with Cryo units before, but Citlali enables them to be meaningfully stronger, and I think her kit has other fun aspects that makes her a lot more interesting. And oh yes, by the way, if you thought I was playing Mavuika's best team, no. I was playing one of DPS Citlali's best team, but we'll talk more about DPS Citlali later. For anyone who normally follows me that might have wanted a DPS Citlali video, I plan to make a separate video, but that's going to wait until Shenhe comes out because I want to explore teams with Shenhe and DPS Citlali because Shenhe is, a cryo buffer. So, to explain why Citlali feels like more of an Archon to me as far as her kit design goes compared to Mavuika, Archon kits felt like they had more supportive relevance to me, right? And Citlali does a lot more of supportive relevance than Mavuika. Can you use Mavuika as a support? Yeah, she does do like her damage bonus, right, from the passive here, and then you can have her off-field pyro, and you have this artifact set, but like, it's not that significant, right? It definitely does not feel like her main role, even when I pulled C1 specifically to do more of off-field things with her. Like I wanted her C1 so that I could, use Mavuika's skill so that her off-field not only lasted longer, that was actually not that important, but more importantly, so I didn't have to like make sure I did normal attacks or had a Natlan character in every single team I dared want to consider using Mavuika off-field in. But if I want to play this team with Mavuika, she can't do this team at C0 and burst consistently. You need C1 for this because Raiden's damage does not count as normal attack damage, so it doesn't build any fighting spirit for her. So that means you either have to force a Natlan unit in the team, like doing, I don't know, Oron instead of Bennett. But like, you get the point, right? Like, the fact that I had to pull C1 to do some of the things that I wanted to do with, like, Mavuika replacing Xiangling, it makes me feel like she doesn't have the same Archon level of kit. An important context for this, by the way, why I feel this way, is I started playing Genshin after Raiden released. Like, quite frankly, I don't think Raiden has a very Archon level kit either, by my definitions. Like Raiden and Mavuika are designed very similarly, where they're intended to be, a on-field DPS with, some off-field utility. But, like, their main intended role, I think that most people are going to use them in is, like, an on-field DPS, right? There's no hard and fast rule that says Mihoyo had to make Archons do supportive relevance, to be clear. But my experience with what I considered an Archon level kit, as far as how it's designed, was with Nahida and Farina. Like, I started playing Genshin after Raiden's release. These were the two Archon releases that I saw, and I saw, like, how significant the effect on, like, team building. Both Farina and Nahida, right, they both had really significant effects, lasting effects on team building options in the game. Raiden was ultimately like an on-field electro DPS that had decent synergy with some existing units, and Mavuika is a strong on-field pyro DPS. That's like what they were made for, and that's fine. But it doesn't feel the same as a character that like uniquely makes a lot of teams where their element is relevant a lot better. And Farina is a similar story of like, her Hydra application, not requiring normal attacks and her damage percent buffing. And of course, let's not forget how significantly Farina changed the value of healers and how we think about them in Genshin. Like, these are the Archon level kits to me, right? Like, I think if Mavuika was going to have the same Archon level kit to me, we pretend like she had, I don't know, let's say an 80% attack buff for the whole team. Like, Bennett only buffs your on-fielder. Let's say Mavuika did less attack buffing than Bennett, but the whole team. Suddenly, Mavuika might be included in a lot of teams for supportive utility just to make your, attack scaling units a lot stronger. That's my point here. But now let's get into Citlali, and why I think Citlali is my Archon, right? First, let's explain her kit real quick. So, yes, she's a shielder. Her shielding is, in my opinion, the least important part of her kit, but it's worth mentioning that her shield is scaled on Elemental Mastery. I made a video recently about, like, building full EM on Yai, and the main conclusion in that video is basically, like, Elemental Mastery is a valuable stat for dealing damage in different ways, and it's more relevant for Electro characters than it is for Cryo characters, generally speaking. But it's a damage stat, right? And it's a stat that gains you more and more value the more reactions you are triggering, ultimately, is really what it is. Being able to double dip in value from Elemental Mastery in some form is really valuable. So having these EM scaling passives to increase her skill damage and her burst damage, this is how she gets like those really big burst damage numbers in conjunction with her big burst attack scaling multiplier. A simpler way is to say, like, you can build Citlali for damage, where I have 578 EM and, you know, a bunch of crit on her, and she will still shield a bit, but also deal meaningful damage, right? Like, I really like when kits have that conjunction of a balance. It's enough of a shield to give you good interruption resistance and decently higher survivability. Like, it's still a comfort option, but she's balanced in a way that doesn't completely replace Zhongli, which is good. Citlali, of course, you know, she is a Natlan character. She builds up Night Soul. Normally, you would use the Natlan Scroll Cinder City set, so this means she can do cryo damage bonus and whatever damage bonus for whatever other element that she triggers a cryo reaction with. That is obviously primarily meant to be either pyro or hydro, so pyro damage bonus, hydro damage bonus. She gains 24 Night Soul points when you use her skill, and when she has 50 Night Soul points, her skill will start, you know, dealing off-field cryo damage, and this applies cryo every 2 seconds, which is important. We'll get into why it's important. Her burst gives her more Night Soul, is necessary to her kit. You're probably going to want to do it anyways because it's a big part of the fun value of Citlali, in my opinion. But you're going to need to do it regardless, generally speaking. Although there is a way around that I'll get into. But you need this extra Night Soul to get her skill to actually last a meaningful amount of time to be able to apply enough cryo to do something with it. Her passive is the 20% res shred when you have freeze or melt being triggered. This should basically permanently be up. So as long as you trigger 2 freeze or melts in a rotation in a team, you get about, 11, 12 seconds, if I recall, of duration for her skill application. And then this passive, as mentioned before, is just the burst amplification passive. And then she has her exploration passive things, which is very important, of course, because she has the custom glide where she just sits on a pillow. Anyways, this kit ultimately seems fairly simple, right? Like, it's just, okay, it's just shield her and she does some buffing and cryo application. Why is that special? It's special because we've gotten crap all for, like, absolute garbage options for cryo off-field in the game. Like, Layla does not do very much off-field cryo, and her damage is not as significant as Citlali, right? Rosaria, notably, I would say, despite being a very early character released in the game, was one of the more compelling cryo off-fielders in the game. They just refused to release like relevant cryo supportive utility. Melt DPS with Diona was a thing that some people do with like Gomming, for example, or Diona with Amber, right? Like there were niche scenarios before Citlali released to do, use your pyro DPS and use cryo to do really big melt damage numbers. But it was generally speaking mostly relegated to really niche scenarios, or scenarios of just trying to hit the biggest damage number in your pyro unit for taking a screenshot. It wasn't that relevant. So Citlali's and Rosaria's cryo application are very similar. They apply cryo every 2 seconds. Really awkward to use. I think if you use Rosaria, you understand the awkwardness of having to like land Rosaria's burst. It's just awkward, to say the least, to try to make Rosaria work. It's not that it was impossible. It's notable though that Citlali existing gives reason to do Citlali plus Rosaria combo together. You get cryo resonance, which means when enemies are affected by cryo, you get bonus crit rate. And then you also get the crit rate from Rosaria. So like a Rosaria plus Citlali combo, this can be like 30% free crit rate. Rosaria was one of the best off-field cryos we had in the game, and she still like was not very compelling, is my point. So anyways, if you ever wanted to consider, doing things with cryo, right, where like cryo can be relevant for melt, as you've probably realized based on anything you might have seen from Citlali and Mavuika together, or Arlecchino and Citlali together, or Gomming and Citlali, or and also it's not worth forgetting that Citlali is not just for pyro units. She does have reason to be used with hydro units as well, and there's relevant hydro units in the game. Cryo has been neglected for a long time by MiHoYo is kind of my overall point. And for us to think of reasons to use cryo units specifically in teams, we have to have better options for cryo application, and not just options for like buffing cryo DPS. Like yes, it would be nice if MiHoYo released more ways to buff Ganyu, but like Mavuika is more relevant for buffing Ganyu than Citlali is. You wouldn't want to do melt Ganyu with Citlali anyways, because Citlali could potentially steal your melts. Hopefully that makes sense, right? Like, Citlali gives new reasons to consider using cryo off-fielders. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, this is quite important. When Citlali has her skill active, so I'll get active in a second, there we go. You can see the little waves of cryo. The AoE is fairly sizable, but the notable thing is it follows you. So you don't have like the Rosaria problem, right? You have Rosaria application that follows you around. But it also means like she adapts to new waves of enemies better, or as enemies move around, right? Crazy idea, enemies move. The previous options we had for off-field cryo in the game were all like had significant enough downsides that generally speaking weren't worth any upside for their downside, right? Whereas Citlali does the right conjunction of things that have enough upside with her defensive utility and her buffing utility, and the way she applies cryo and the timings she applies cryo that give new reasons to consider doing pyro damage dealers with her, or putting her into teams with hydro to use her as a more generic buffer. To be clear, I don't think this character is Farina level where you're going to start inserting cryo units into every single team. That'd be a bit absurd. You are certainly free to disagree with how much she is an Archon level character to you personally. I'm just trying to outline the reasons that she's an Archon level character for me, because she enables new teams that I wouldn't have considered meaningfully using before. I want to go over real quick the Pyro and Hydro units, because that's her base kit is mostly meant to be paired with Hydro and Pyro units. She's the ones there that she's actually meaningfully buffing. I have not found her to be universally useful for every single Pyro unit I have. Obviously Mavuika, yes, Arlecchino gains a lot from her. Dia, I was actually hoping to gain meaningfully from Citlali, but unfortunately I could not find the right way to use Citlali and Dia together that felt that relevant. Citlali and Dia, basically Dia can get a few melts when I played around with it, but not melts throughout her whole burst, and that made it feel like it wasn't necessarily crazily relevant, but it also wasn't terrible, so I don't know, I gotta mess around with it more. If you enjoy Dia as much as I do, I would not specifically pull Citlali for Dia, but it's also not an anti-synergy, right? Chevreuse, unless you're doing DPS, Chevreuse does not normally use Cryo. I guess if you want, let me know in the comments if I should revisit DPS Chevreuse. I can maybe do something with Citlali. Amber, I actually, I recently made an Amber video because I got C4 Amber, and I briefly showed a melt team in that video, but because of how awkward it was, I just didn't choose to focus on it in the video versus a Vaporize Amber team with Farina. But I think a melt team with Amber, like Amber is a use case where I think Citlali fixes the main problems I had with melt Amber. I do think if you're a dedicated Amber main, you probably should seriously consider getting Citlali. Shenling, of course, can gain just because, Pyro Res Shred and Pyro damage bonus when you're putting Citlali in a team. Pyro Traveler, I imagine if you're trying to get really big damage from Pyro Traveler, yeah, you'll probably want Citlali. Gaming already had compelling melt teams before Citlali's release, and Citlali is, I believe, just like a slot-in replacement for Rosaria, I would think, and would be a meaningful upgrade. Yanfei I haven't seen anyone really messing with, but I suspect Yanfei probably could have something that works with Citlali, but it might be... Like, the weird context of Citlali with a lot of Pyro DPS is you're gonna have to figure out, like, what the exact timing combos is. Because you have to, like, do jump cancels, for example, on Mavuika to delay when you actually apply Pyro so that you can keep up the Cryo application in order to get the big melts on Mavuika. Arlecchino's kind of a similar story where you delay some of her normal attacks to keep up getting melts. So Yanfei is probably a very similar story. And I suspect Dilu will be as well. And, I don't know, DPS Xinyan with C6 Bennett, maybe. Well, I guess, if you want to do DPS Bennett, one of Bennett's adventure team members probably very well could be Citlali. The important point I'm trying to make here is that Citlali, by nature of me having all these ideas that come to my head just by looking at the characters and potential synergies with them, should tell you that this character has a lot of potential versatility. Also, I don't have every single Hydro Pyro unit in the game. There's, Hu Tao I don't think is super relevant with Citlali, but you could correct me if I'm wrong. Mualani is a little weird with Citlali because, the Cryo could interfere with your ability to get Vaporizes on Mualani. I do think there are some people that are using Mualani and Citlali together, but I don't think it's that compelling, in my opinion. But if you have enough Pyro application going on that the Cryo does not end up overtaking, and you can still get Vaporizes, Citlali will, buff Mualani, so it's not a terrible option. Farina is, I think, one of the really, really strong synergies with Citlali. It is worth mentioning, she is a Catalyst user, and that means she can use Prototype Amber. Citlali does have energy needs, and this weapon also refunds energy to Citlali as well, and, the team-wide healer is also just a more comfort option. Citlali potentially giving damage bonus to Farina, and being a healer option for Farina, even if you don't have C2 Farina, it's a synergy worth considering. Yelan, of course, could gain meaningfully from it. I actually think Kokomi could gain meaningfully from it as well. Kokomi does do not insignificant Hydro damage, even if she's not critting. Candace, does have some synergy by just being a Hydro, but doesn't do that much damage. Xingqiu can be made to do meaningful damage, so yes, could appreciate some damage bonus in Red Shred. Mona, generally speaking, no. Nubilet does gain meaningfully from having Citlali. If you don't have his C1 in particular, the shield is nice, but also, again, if you don't have a C1, to get more charge attack damage on him, you need to have multiple, different Hydra reactions happening in the team, and, hey, you got Cryo, Freeze, that's a Hydra reaction, who knew? And Barbara, I don't know, you could do DPS Barbara or whatever other things with Barbara. She's not a useless character by any means. Ayato and Child, I think, have some interesting potential synergies as well. Lastly, I think it's worth mentioning a significant synergy to Cryo units that not many people consider Dendro units. Generally speaking, have good reasons to play, I don't know, Hydra units with Dendro units, which means that all these full kit will work. Dendro units with Cryo units, they don't react. But what can happen in particular with Hydro going on? You can get extra Dendro core generation, the bloom cores, right, by having a Cryo unit in the team, because it reduces the amount of Hydra that is consumed every time you produce a bloom reaction is the simple explanation for it. So in a weird roundabout way, Citlali can functionally increase what you get out of your Dendro application. I've played around with her already in a bunch of different variants of Dendro teams, so yeah, she's not getting Dendro damage bonus or anything, right? But she is buffing the Hydra unit on the team, so if you're playing with Yelan or Frida in particular, I'd say it's a pretty significant synergy on top of her defensive value that she can have. Point being is Virgin teams and Hyperbloom teams that don't use Nahida in particular, but even ones with Nahida, can gain meaningful value from adding Cryo into the mix. Not having a reaction by nature of the two elemental auras being able to exist at the same time on enemies can be a synergy into itself. A ton of potential different team options for Citlali, right? Now, to talk about DPS Citlali very briefly, one thing to mention quick as far as artifacts go, normally you would use 4-piece Scroll of Cinder City, but an interesting thing happens in my opinion that with the Shalonen and Citlali combo in particular is that you don't necessarily have as much of a reason to use Scroll on Citlali because someone else is doing the buffing. You could use this set on her. With a build like I have right now, where I have Sac Frags, which is helping with her energy needs, Cryo Goblet, Crit Circlet, EM Timepiece. I have about 88% crit rate and 140 crit damage. And with this kind of build in this team, you can probably expect like in the neighborhood of 250,000 damage consistently on her burst. And that is enough front-loaded damage that might be enough to say clear a wave of enemies that like think about the trash bombs that they're putting before our bosses in Abyss recently, right? If you can kill those enemies with Citlali's burst before you have to burst on Mavuika, that can save your Mavuika's big burst multiplier for the actual big tanky boss that spawns, which can functionally increase your clear time significantly. Like, there is actually value to putting Citlali on a DPS build, even in the context of a normal team, right? But if you want to DPS Citlali and leave her on field, there is some nuance. Since she is a catalyst, she does do, cryo normal attack. She throws her pillar around, which is of course amusing. She can also do this charge attack. She can also do her jump up ability, and you can do a special plunge where she has a little pillow plunge animation. Right, you have actually a surprisingly high number of options for doing extra things on field with her. That can be some additional extra cryo application if you need it on demand as well. The charge attack will always apply cryo, and so will her plunge attack. But of course, those both take a lot of stamina. The charge attack takes 50. I believe jumping up in Citlali takes something... Oh, I have focused on here so you can't see it. But when you're not in Natlan, this jump up normally takes in the neighborhood of, I think, like 100 stamina or even more. So it's very expensive to do, like, plunge DPS Citlali without Cloud Retainer. Her charge attack is also kind of unique in that it does pierce enemies. So you can see it goes a set range and then it eventually just stops. You do have to be a bit careful if you're like trying to actually hit as many enemies as possible. You can't aim too much at the ground, otherwise it explodes in the ground and probably won't hit enemies. And again, it's not a very high multiplier, like we're talking 138% multiplier, but being able to apply cryo, trigger a melt every single time is like a significant value add. In this team, what I have basically found when DPSing Citlali is that I can get in the neighborhood of like 30k hits on her charge attack. But if I do too many charge attacks, like that's extra cryo application that in conjunction with her, skills cryo application, her cryo sometimes ends up overtaking it, and then Mavuika, when she's doing her off-field pyro, ends up triggering melts instead of Citlali. I still consider that DPS Citlali, whether or not Citlali or Mavuika is triggering melts, because no matter what, you're triggering beneficial reactions, basically, is the idea in this team. One of the reasons I'm interested in Shenhe for DPS Citlali is because of the low multipliers on these, though, because I would like to, just see bigger damage numbers from her pillow, or her charge attack, or her plunge even. You can do Shunyun Melt Plunge. You can do this team You could do Shenhe things. Feel free to subscribe for a future video on that. Point being, there's just a surprisingly high amount of options, I would say, for DPS Citlali. You could do burn melt teams with DPS Citlali, yada yada. May as well do a quick demonstration, I suppose. Alright, do that. Do this. Guess I could do that in Bennett first, but who cares? I'm doing DPS Citlali. Blam. And blam. Nice 300k. And you can see this is what I was talking about here, where our Cryo ended up overtaking, actually. Generally speaking, depending on the situation, I think I can time things to try to specifically get melts on Citlali, but you can see Mavuika's melts are significant enough that it's probably better to get melts on Mavuika in this team. So it's more like this is just a team that you can get a very satisfying, pretty consistent big number from Citlali, when normally you wouldn't be able to consistently see, that big crit from Citlali. Her energy needs and needing, EM main stats would, generally speaking, mean you see like 100k non-crit or whatever. I also pulled for Citlali's signature weapon. This, with her C0 kit, this weapon is basically irrelevant. I still have to activate C1. C1 will give more value to the signature weapon. We'll talk about C1 in a second. Her energy needs ended up being higher than I expected. Like, she's a little bit of an annoying character to build, particularly if you're like me and you like building crit because you just like seeing a big number. Like my normal Citlali build, let me switch to it. Alright, there we go. Looks like this. 1044 EM with 31 crit rate, 96 crit damage, and 150 ER. That is with sack frags. This is definitely enough energy with sack frags and the energy refund from 4P scroll in basically every situation, including solo cryo, where you don't have many fabs on the team. With her signature weapon, you can see, oh wow, I go up to 1189 EM, except for this is nowhere near enough energy. One of the teams that I like playing Citlali in, for example, is Arlecchino and Citlali together, where she is solo cryo, and she needs like around 200 energy recharge is what I found, without any other fab users on the team. I do have a build that can achieve 200 ER with her signature weapon, but the problem with that is I basically have to sacrifice all of my crit to get that much energy recharge. I find one of Citlali's most fun aspects personally to be her big, burst hits. 30% crit rate is not very consistent, of course, but it is high enough that you will see crits surprisingly often that it just really increases the fun value of her, in my opinion. So I don't really like her signature because it prevents me from doing the things that I have fun with on this character. But I still do need to test it with C1, and the reason is because C1 gives it a flat damage buff based on her element of mastery. It increases her element of mastery, but also the weapon gives a damage percent buff, so that further increases the value of the flat damage buff. Also, the Sack Frags extends her skill duration is notable because it gives you extra Night Soul. Oh, and another thing Sack Frags does is because, you just get extra 24 Night Soul from using a skill twice, you don't have to burst every rotation with Sack Frags. Like, normally you still should, because Sack Frags should reduce your energy needs enough that it shouldn't be that hard to. You need to have an R4 or R5 Sack Frags, by the way, for this stuff I'm talking about. Otherwise, she will only be able to get the reset like every other rotation, and that's... every other rotation is not useful, basically. Is a more universal option. Extends her cryo application, like she gets at least 1 or 2 extra instances of cryo application depending on the situation, which can actually let you get an additional melt on your Arlecchino. It's kind of like getting part of C4 for free in Citlali's kit. The point is, I really like Sack Frags on her, and even with C1, I might end up using Sack Frags, because if you read her C1, she can reset her stacks on her buff, so that means like the skill reset might actually selectively be really useful for even C1. So anyways, her weapon is overrated. It's basically just a slightly more convenient Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers. Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers is very good, of course, if you're willing to work around the annoyance of it. An important thing about Citlali's C1 is that this enables Citlali to be a buffer for any kind of on-field damage in the game. I want to go in depth in this video about what I think C1 Citlali is really interesting for, and how she becomes a much more interesting buffer for so many different situations. Like, I think C1 Citlali is what will let me actually have much more fun with DPS Kachina, for example. I don't know how comfortable I am though with gushing about a constellation. I think this might be my favorite constellation in the game. I haven't activated it yet. This feeling might change. But based on my game knowledge, I do think it will be a really fun one. Take that for what you will, right? This is an extremely fun constellation because I'm the type of player who likes to do weird shenanigans, like trying to DPS characters that, are not intended to be DPSs. If you don't understand what C1 Citlali does and how it can benefit DPS Kachina, or how it could increase DPS shift versus damage, I wouldn't pull it for that. But it is a relevant factor to me, and I felt like it's worth mentioning that. Last thing, I Normally I don't care about voice lines in like characterization that much, but Citlali is the first character in a while that I really, really liked the characterization of, particularly in contrast to Mavuika, who, I'm sorry, from my perspective, Mavuika has the personality of a piece of wet cardboard. You know, you might glance on the ground and wonder, why is there a piece of wet cardboard there? What's its story? And then you don't think about it ever again. The writers seem to want to have Citlali to have actual character traits compared to Mavuika, from my point of view. And I just want to point out a couple voice lines that I think are great. One, about Auron. And let's not forget her hobbies.
My life is nearly completely devoid of meaning.
Yeah.
Nothing remains but groggy stupor after sleeping, delusional fantasies from novels, and the comfort at the bottom of a bottle.
Thankfully, I'm not that far gone. But, you know, yeah, look, I make Genshin Impact videos for a living. And you have this line.
I'm someone with a lot of restraint, you know.
Yep.
After I wake up, I never drink before noon.
Never drinks before noon. And then if we look here.
But anything to get her to stop waking me up at 11 in the morning. Oh, I mean, never mind.
So, I don't know, maybe this character is just too relatable to me and I'm biased towards everything is my point, I guess. So yeah, this was mostly just a very talk-focused video. I just had a lot of thoughts in my head about the different things I liked about Citlali. Hopefully my point got across. Maybe I could have shown more things rather than just telling you about them, but I couldn't really decide what specifically to show, so I just chose to talk about everything. Ultimately, this character gives me a lot more reasons to think about like doing things with cryo reactions in the game, and I never really considered it that serious of a synergy before because the cryo options we had for off-field cryo supports just weren't that relevant, right? This character enables new reasons for me to use cryo in the game because she does enough in her kit to actually be relevant compared to the other options that are available. This is kind of what we needed to make cryo relevant, in my opinion. To be clear, I would still like, you know, more options for making, you know, on-field cryo DPS relevant, but I'm fairly confident even if I didn't care that much about Citlali as a character, I would like her kit a lot more, and she would still be more of an Archon to me than Mavuika is. And if I wasn't a content creator, quite frankly, I think I would have pulled for Citlali and her constellations over getting any copy of Mavuika. That's my overall feelings. You don't have to share them. Feel free to jump in the comments below and share your thoughts. Have a wonderful day.